try to make our neuroscientific conception of the mind a little bit more about the lived life of the mind, a little bit less about information processing devices, and to bring neuroscience into psychoanalysis to try to ground our theories of the workings of the mind in health and disease in psychoanalysis, to ground that upon a more evidence-based, neuroscience-based approach. Given the times that we are in, this is now possible, unlike in Freud's times. And so, to the horror of my colleagues, I said, "Come on, let's try and do this." I've been at that job since the mid-1980s, trying to translate psychoanalytical concepts into their neuroscientific realization. And as I set about doing that and presenting my findings to my neuroscientific and my psychoanalytical colleagues, there was a growing interest among the psychoanalysts saying, yes, that's all, that's fantastic. So, you know, we now know what the neural correlates of our basic psychodynamic concepts are, but also a growing frustration in terms of, well, what does it actually mean? What are the practical implications of all of this for what we actually do? And what I said to them in the face of this frustration was that the purpose of grounding our models of the psychodynamic mind in neuroscience is so that we can find what's wrong with it. You know, it's inevitable that as you try to translate psychoanalytical concepts into neuroscientific terms, there's a point at which the translation becomes impossible. That is to say, where the psychodynamic concepts do not fit with what we learn from a neuroscientific point of view as to how these things work. And I said at that point, it will become possible for me to make recommendations as to what we should do differently, because what we do in our clinical work as psychoanalysts and psychotherapists is based on a theory of how the mind works, and to the extent that that theory is mistaken, to that extent what we're doing will be misguided. It was in 2010 that I finally came upon a whopping great error in the Freudian theory, by which I mean it became apparent that there was great difficulty in translating one of Freud's most fundamental concepts into neuroscientific terms, and that then had all kinds of knock-on effects, which in turn has led to me making recommendations, having to make recommendations to my analytic colleagues as to what they should be doing differently. So that's what I've been asked to talk to you about, the clinical implications of neuropsychoanalysis. The only problem is that I have less than an hour to do it in, and this is 30 years work, so you know it's not really possible. There are two ways I can go about it. I can give you the most schematic overview, or I can dive in trying to give you something more of the substance of it, with the risk that I might not be able to cover all the ground that I want to. And so between those two bad options, I chose the second bad option. So let's hope that I'm able to cover enough ground. In the clinical seminar afterwards, where we're going to discuss a case, I'm glad that there'll be an opportunity there, at least for some of you, for me to be able to go through in a slower way some of the practical, clinical, technical implications of what I'm now going to say, which is mainly theoretical. The mistake that I'm referring to in Freud has to do with his theory of the id. The id, that is to say, the pole of the mind that represents demands upon the mind to perform work by dint of the fact that we are, of course, embodied creatures. Like all other species, we are a species of animal. There are demands upon the mind to perform work. The mind is there for that purpose, to meet our needs, our species-specific needs in the world. And it's Freud's conceptualization of that part of the mind where I found that there was really a need for a radical revision. That in turn, I'm going to tell you about that first. That in turn has big implications for our understanding, as you will see, of what is conscious and what is unconscious in the mind. That flows naturally from the reconceptualization of what Freud called the id. And then that also has implications for our taxonomy of what the basic needs, especially the basic emotional needs of the human being are. Freud had this famous drive theory, which he always knew was frank speculation, you know, sitting behind the couch, listening to everything that comes into your patients' heads. Hardly a good methodological basis for determining the fundamental biological motivating forces of our species. But with the tools available to us today, we have radically different and fundamentally important conceptualizations of that, which I want also to say a thing or two to you about. That, by the way, is the most interesting part for those of you who are not psychotherapists or not particularly interested in psychotherapy, because it's in terms of our conceptualization of the basic emotional need and motivational systems of the human brain that there is a transitional area, an area of overlapping interest between psychopharmacology and psychodynamics. So as you can see, it's a gigantic area I have to cover, and it's a kind of fool's errand, but let's go. I'm going to start by describing something to you which will appear to you to be irrelevant to what I've just said I'm going to talk about, but bear with me, it's highly relevant. What I'm going to talk about is how the body is represented in the brain. This turns out to have big implications for our conceptualization of consciousness and of these basic motivational forces that I've been referring to. I see my pointer doesn't register when it's on there, so I'm going to, let me just show you what I mean. It points very nicely there, but once we get there, nothing happens. So I'm going to point in the old-fashioned way as we go along. And I know you have a camera, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to therefore move a bit. So, not to put too fine a point on it, the body is represented in the brain in two different ways. And there are two different aspects of the body that are represented in these two different ways, and that, as I said earlier, has big implications for consciousness. The first I'm going to call, the first aspect of the body, I'll call it the external body for short, as opposed to the internal body. The external body I'm referring to is the sensory, motor, muscular, skeletal, ambulatory body that you see in the mirror. The internal body is the visceral, vegetative, autonomic body. I'm starting with the external body. You all know this stuff, so I won't belabor it. The external body, or rather the sensory surfaces, the external sensory receptor surfaces, are projected onto the surface of the cortex in the primary projection zones, and I've indicated the three main ones in dark blue there. And let's start with the cortical homunculus, which is the best known example of what I'm talking about. The sense of somatic sensation, colloquially called the sense of touch, a general sensation, touch, pain, temperature, vibration, joint and muscle sense. Those sensory receptors are projected in a point-by-point fashion, literally mapped. And this is a terribly important concept in terms of what I'm going to speak about next. It's an image mapped, projected literally onto the brain of the somatosensory surface of the body in such a way that we have a little person in the head, the famous cortical homunculus, which is Latin for little man. I'm afraid it's not little person, it's little man, but I will update it and just call it the little person in the head. And there on the surface of the right hemisphere we have the left side of the face projected down here, the left hand projected over there, the left side of the torso, genitals, and over the medial surface, the legs and feet. Literally a map. On the occipital lobe, there's similarly a map, a point-by-point projection of the retinae. Again, upside down, back to front, like the cortical homunculus. And in each in their own way, the same applies to the auditory sense, and within, opening up the Sylvian fissure, to the sense of smell and the sense of taste. This is how the external body is mapped onto the brain. It fits with our common sense, by which I mean consciousness is made up of these 5 ingredients that I've just referred to. These are referred to as the contents of consciousness. And this starts from common sense through British empiricist philosophy, Hume and Locke and that lot, through to the classical neuroanatomists, this conception of what consciousness is constituted of and where it is located in the brain has been with us for, well, really more than 100 years. What's changed in recent decades as far as our conceptualization of the cortical representation of the body is concerned is that as much as we've always focused on how these projection zones are where our basic modalities, the basic contents, ingredients of consciousness come from, there is nothing else than those 5 modalities. What's been of interest over the last few decades is the extent to which those same cortical structures also subserve unconscious cognitive processes. And this was, and I'm referring not only to the projection zones, and of course let's not forget the green motor homunculus, it's the same principle. But in the light blue and yellow association cortices, the cognitive processes derived from perceptual representations and traces of previous perceptual representation. The work of the cortex it does not require consciousness to do its job. And this has, to a surprising extent, become apparent over the last decades of the previous century. It's really not controversial anymore. Everybody knows the vast bulk of cognition is performed unconsciously. And by cognition, I need to emphasize, this implies not only non-declarative associative processes, but also cortical processes themselves, as is evidenced, for example, and I mentioned just one for the interest of time, reading. You can read gestoscopically flashed images, you can read and comprehend words. They will influence your behavior even though you've had absolutely no conscious experience. Reading is an unequivocally cortical function, and so this is just one of the bits of oodles of evidence that we have that the cortex can do its job without consciousness. And the question therefore seriously arose as to, well, what on earth is the consciousness for? You know, if the cortex can do all of this perceptual and cognitive processing, learning and memory and goal-directed activity, cognitive activity without consciousness. In a famous review paper, Barge and Chartrand, the paper was titled "The Unbearable Automaticity of Being." In that paper, they reviewed the literature and came to the conclusion that 95% of our goal-directed activities in waking life are unconsciously executed. So the question, as I was saying, seriously arose, well, you know, consciousness is such a troublesome thing. You know, why do we need it at all? And that leads me to the second part of what I wanted to tell you about how the body is represented in the brain. The internal body, that is to say, as I mentioned, the visceral, autonomic, vegetative body, is projected not in a somatotopic point-by-point map-like fashion onto the red structures, and I'm only indicating the main structures here. Here's the nucleus of the solitary tract, the area postrema, parabrachial nucleus, circumventricular organs, and of course the big head office in the hypothalamus. These are collectively known as body monitoring nuclei, and they're monitoring the state of the visceral body in relation to various parameters which are essential to life. So there's a constant monitoring of, for example, blood pressure, blood sugar, hydration in relation to your water levels, in relation to salt levels, sugar, etc. And this gives rise, the monitoring of these vital functions. There's not just a monitoring, it's also a regulating of these functions. This is what we mean by autonomic nervous activity. And it's important to remember the obvious about this, which is that these nuclei, I mean, thank God we have them, they are absolutely essential to keeping you alive. They're very narrow ranges within which you have to remain in regard to all of these vital parameters. Like, for example, if I just mention one of them, again, just to illustrate the point, core body temperature, you know, you want to be between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. If you deviate from that in either direction, you know, you're starting to get into trouble. And so you have to remain, you have to be, the basic homeostatic mechanisms of these nuclei is to ensure that the organism remains within those narrow ranges that are necessary for life. The way that they do that is autonomically, as I said. So, for example, in the case that I've just mentioned of core body temperature regulation, if you move outside, let's say if you get too hot, then there's a change in your perspiration and heart rate and breathing rate, and this is a kind of a cooling down system. But there's a point beyond which it fails. That is to say, you can't And perhaps temperature was a bad example, hydration might be a better example. You can't just decide, okay, I'm going to generate more water, because I really need more. You can't. In fact, the whole psychoanalytic theory of narcissism probably arrives from that. You can try, but you will fail, it'll end in tears. And that is why we have to engage with the outside world, which is why these red body monitoring nuclei project onto the purple ones, which I've again only schematically shown some of the main structures, collectively known as the extended reticulothalamic activating system. These structures activate the forebrain, because the forebrain, which represents via its cortices, the external body, the regulation of and representation of the external world via these receptor organs distributed over the surface of the external body, and the musculoskeletal system. This is how we engage with the world in order to regulate these, to maintain these vital functions. If I may be philosophical for a moment, here's a philosophy for you. Life is difficult. And why life is difficult is for the reasons I've just described to you. You cannot narcissistically or autonomously meet your vital bodily needs. You have to engage with the outside world. That's where the things are that you need in order to stay alive. And the basic mechanism that I've described is how we go about doing that. So these red structures feed into the reticular activating system, which activates the forebrain, which then is a demand upon the mind to perform work, and the mind, as it were, the cortices, regulate, and the cognitive functions that I spoke of earlier, regulate the meeting of your needs in the outside world. Now, I said that this is not a mapping of the body, the visceral functions. You don't have a literal image of your, what's going on in your dilation of your blood vessels and whatnot. You don't have an image of what your current blood glucose is. These things are measured in terms of, it's a measurement, it's a degree, it's a state change rather than an image or a picture as we have from the outside world. And what I'm heading towards is the type of consciousness that these activating or arousal structures generates is quite different from perceptual consciousness. It's this global background state of consciousness, which when it was first discovered in the 1950s by Magoon and Maruzzi, we referred to as the level of consciousness. Remember, it was a great surprise that nobody expected that in the core of the brain stem there would be endogenous consciousness generating structures, but they are. And in order to preserve or make sense of our classical conception of the contents of consciousness, we drew this distinction between contents and level. Now, that's what's changed in the 1990s. That aspect of consciousness, which was always the preserve of neurosurgeons measuring on the Glasgow Coma scale, the level of consciousness, where are you from 3 to 15? I've always found it slightly amusing that even if you're dead, you get 3. But the point is that it's quantitative. It's a degree of consciousness, wakeful, vigilance through stupor down to coma. The anaesthetists also are concerned with this aspect of consciousness, and thank God for anaesthetists. But the surprise, which sort of only dawned on us in the 1990s, is that it's not only the preserve of neurosurgery and anesthesiology, this part of the brain. In fact, it's your domain. The major psychotropic medications act on these structures, like, for example, on the RAFE nuclei. The source cells of the serotonergic projections to the forebrain are located in the activating system. And you're trying to change mood by giving these drugs. Likewise, the source cells of the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system are in the ventral tegmental area over there, also part of the activating system. The same applies, of course, to the nucleus locus coeruleus complex and noradrenaline, or norepinephrine as you call it. These are your bread and butter. The tinkering with these neuromodulators does not only change the level of consciousness, it changes its state in relation to a particular quality that we call affect. And when I said to you earlier, the ingredients of consciousness are these 5 perceptual modalities, many of you nodded happily because, and I said, well, of course, there's nothing else. It's just not true. There is something else. The contents of consciousness include affects. And astonishingly, in our basic classical theory of brain mechanisms of consciousness, until all of this dawned on us, and as I said, it took a good few decades for us to properly realize what we had discovered in the 50s, it dawned on us in the 90s that these arousal structures are in fact the brain mechanisms that generate affectivity. And by affect, I need to emphasize, the word tends to generally be used in relation to emotional affects. There aren't only emotional affects. Feelings of the kind that I alluded to right at the very beginning, like hunger and thirst and being too cold and being sleepy, these are also affects. They are feelings, feeling states, and they have not to do with the state of the outside world registered on your external sensory receptor surfaces, but rather to do with the state of the organism itself. And the famous theory of Damasio gradually evolved. In parallel, there was the work of Jaap Panksepp, coming to the same conclusions from different methodological points of view, that this is what affect is. Affect is the state of the subject. And now I need to emphasize a very crucial thing about the relationship between these two types of consciousness. It was always recognized since the 50s that the upper brainstem, these core arousal structures, that they are the foundations of consciousness, that if those structures are lesioned, then the upper stories, the extraceptive consciousness collapses with the background state of consciousness. And this was in tune with the conception of what the arousal systems did, which was volume control. How much consciousness is there? But when we realize that these structures are not purely quantitative, they are not purely arousal structures, they are affect modulating structures, that they have a quality of their own, the implication of this, which I really want to underscore because it's terribly important for what you do, is that consciousness itself is affective, that the foundations of consciousness are affective, that the subject, the primary sentient being of consciousness, the quality or the modality of that type of consciousness is affect. And all of the extraceptive modalities cannot exist without the prior presence, as it were, affective presence of the subject of consciousness. And an easy way to phrase what I've just said to you, and also to demonstrate the obvious necessity of what I've just described, is that you cannot have objects of consciousness, images derived from the external sensory modalities. You cannot have objects of consciousness unless there's a subject of consciousness there to have the objects. So you first have to be conscious. And that, I say again, remember, has a quality. It is affective. And then you can feel your way into your perceptual cognitive processes, which are not intrinsically conscious. So it's only when you feel them, when you sort of palpate them, as it were, that you become conscious. And this begins to address the question that I left hanging a few minutes ago as to what on earth is the consciousness for. Everything I've said so far is just simple empiricism, simple facts. Here's a little bit of theory. Both Damasio and Panksepp and others, and it's a pretty mainstream theory in affective neuroscience, came to the view, and this is a theory, that this is what consciousness is for. Consciousness is for feeling. That consciousness evolved so that the organism can know its own state in relation to its vital needs, where there is a value system. And let us not forget, biology has a value system, which is that it is good to survive and to reproduce. It is bad to die and to not reproduce. This is the sort of basic, I'm not saying that should be your value system, and in fact, I'll come back to whether you yourself identify with that value system, but this is just the basic laws of how biology works. This is how the driving engine of evolution. And the theory of Damasio is that consciousness evolved because it enables the organism in the here and now to determine how it is doing within that biological scale of values. Consciousness is qualitative, valuative stuff. And this is why it's what it is, and this is how and why it arose. It's so that the organism could monitor how it's doing and think about the enormous adaptive advantage that comes with that. Otherwise, everything's reflexive and everything's obligatory. When this happens, I do this. When that happens, I do that. To be able to feel your way through the situation affectively here and now is an enormous addition of flexibility and adaptability to a non-rigid range of environmental niches. Before I move on, I just want to point out that the whole of affect is not boiled down just to body monitoring. There are also emotional affects. The emotional affects have to do with these structures which are just very loosely indicated there with the white arrows. These are instinctual emotional systems. They are not to do with the monitoring of their body. They're to do with monitoring of environmental situations of universal biological significance. Things like fear. You don't have to learn what to do when a lion comes at you. You have built into your brain an instinctual emotional response, which is the feeling of trepidatious fear, and then that triggers the prediction as to what you should do about it. This is not learnt, it's an innate prediction of a motor action program built into the brain, which is that I should freeze, and if that doesn't work, I flee. That's fear, one example of an emotional affect. Another one, and I'll just mention it very briefly, because if I have time, I'm going to come to the taxonomy of all of these emotional needs. But another one is attachment bonding, for example. You separate a juvenile mammal from its caregiver, it panics, and it protests, and it searches. All mammals do that. That's another instinctual emotional need. We need to stay close to our caregivers. We need to stay safe from predators. So these are not body monitoring affects. These are emotional affects. They have, as I say, to do with environment, with relations to the external world, but they are of survival and reproductive value, no less than the body monitoring ones are. So there we have it, the basic structure of the brain in relation to the two aspects of the body. In fact, you could go so far as to say, I've just described to you the whole functional arrangement of the brain. The brain registers the needs of the organism. It registers those in terms of affects. These arouse the forebrain, which then drives the external body and environment representing structures. That is where these needs can be met. And then, of course, learning from experience, which is what cognition is all about. Learning how to meet your needs in the world is basically what the brain's there for. It is a link between the internal body and the external body, mediated by learning from experience. So there you have it, okay? That's how the body is represented in the brain. Now psychoanalysis. This is Sigmund Freud, a famous paper that he wrote called The Ego and the Id, and here he defines the ego for us. He says, and I know you can't all read it, so I'll read it for you. Believe me, I'm not cheating. Freud says, the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus of the anatomists, which stands on its head in the cortex, sticks up its heels, faces backwards, and as we know, has its speech area on the left-hand side. He elaborates in the same paper, the ego is ultimately derived from bodily sensations, chiefly from those springing from the surface of the body. It may thus be regarded as a mental projection of the surface of the body, besides, as we've seen above, representing the superficies of the mental apparatus. And what he means there in that last statement is referring to a little drawing he did, where he shows at the top of this sketch of the mind, there's this little disc-like structure which he calls the perceptual consciousness system on the top. That's what he means by the superficies of the apparatus. So what I've just showed you is Freud's definition of where the ego comes from. It's no great shakes. What he's saying is the ego, it learns from experience. And experience comes via the external perceptual modalities, and they are projected onto the surface of the mind, that is to say, onto the cortex, and Freud is himself neurologizing his theory here, that it's derived from that. And then these association cortices, the memory traces, and integration of knowledge derived from direct perceptual experience is what Freud calls the reality principle. And that's what governs the ego, which learns about the outside world through engaging with it via the mechanisms I've just described. Okay, so that's Freud's ego. Here's his id. He says the id, cut off from the external world, has a world of perception of its own. It detects with extraordinary acuteness certain changes in its interior, especially oscillations in the tension of its instinctual needs, and these changes become conscious as feelings in the pleasure-unpleasure series. It's hard to say, to be sure, by what means and with the help of what sensory terminal organs these perceptions come about, but it's an established fact that self-perceptions, kinesthetic feelings and feelings of pleasure, unpleasure, govern the passage of events in the id with despotic force. The id obeys the inexorable pleasure principle. This word instinctual needs, it's badly translated. The German word is Trieb, which means drive. But it doesn't matter. Freud defines what he means by that word here. He says a Trieb, or an instinct as it was translated, appears to us as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body, that is to say, with the internal body. So I hope you can see that what I've just described to you in very basic Freudian theory, the ego and the id, correspond to what I just described to you in terms of body representation in the brain. Freud never doubted that the mind is embodied, and it is, as it were, tethered to the body at its two ends. The ego is tethered to our sensory receptor organs projected onto the surface of the cortex. This is how we become aware of the outside world and learn from experience, the so-called reality principle. And the id is tethered to the internal body, that is to say, to the demands arising from our vital needs, which are felt as affects, and this gives rise to this pleasure principle, which governs the passage of events in the id with despotic force. So that's a very happy translation. If you remember what I said to you in my introductory remarks, the value of making such a translation is that it then becomes possible to do detailed neuroscientific work on Freud's id. You know, Freud, as I said, had to sort of thumbsuck what are the basic instinctual drives of the human organism, and now we can say, well, you know, we know where these structures are, we know how they work, we have technologies available to really pin down what are the basic need systems and how do they function and how do the id and the ego relate to each other. I'm well aware I'm using antiquated terminology. That's the whole point, is that we can now turn these old terms into functional systems within the organ of the mind, and we can do science on them. So here's a little drawing of what I've just told you. There's that drawing of Freud's that I mentioned. There's his system, perceptual consciousness, floating on the surface of the mind. Here's his id. So the id is where the drives come from. I've colored it the same color as the body monitoring nuclei, giving rise to what I've colored here in purple, you know, the arousal structures, which give rise to these pleasures and unpleasures, the affective demands on the mind to perform work. And then the dark blue is the perceptual surface and what Freud called the preconscious, you know, these executive structures which regulate our cognition in relation to the so-called reality principle. So that's great. That's what my life's work's all about. I'm wanting to translate these things, and now we can do some science on the id, and we can find out, you know, the sort of thing I was saying to you earlier. But here, I hope you can spot the mistake. There's a gigantic problem here, which is this word here, unconscious. Freud's id, the lower foundations of the mind, are unconscious. And for Freud, consciousness derives from the external perceptual surface. And as I've just summarized for you, the actual state of affairs is precisely the other way around. The font of all consciousness is the part of the brain, the reticular activating system in relation to these body monitoring nuclei and the limbic circuits that arise from them, the drives and the instincts. Clearly that's what we're talking about. These parts of the brain are not only consciousness generating, they are all consciousness generating. Consciousness derives from Freud's id, so it cannot possibly be the unconscious. And conversely, Freud's system conscious, that is to say the cortical systems, are in fact not intrinsically conscious. They borrow their consciousness, as it were. They are activated from below by these structures that correspond with what Freud called id. So Freud's model of the mind in relation to consciousness and the unconscious is precisely upside down. And that is not just a theoretical point, because I want to quickly remind you that for Freud, the basic mechanism of his talking cure is that words being perceptual things, being derived from auditory perception, are capable of consciousness. And so we attach words to these inchoate goings-on in our id, in our unconscious, so that we can become conscious of it. So the whole essence of the talking cure is attaching consciousness via external perceptual representations and words, dragging that consciousness down into the unconscious depths of the id, so that we can think it, so that we can become conscious of it. That model must be absolutely wrong, because the consciousness in fact bubbles up from below. The task of the ego is in fact to manage, to tame, to modulate, to regulate those affects. Not to put too fine a point on it, the ideal of ego development is to have so managed, so met all of your needs in the world that you will be affectless, you'll be a zombie. As you have a need, you immediately know what to do to meet it. That's the ideal of learning. It's the ideal of affect regulation. It's the ideal of the design of what Freud calls the ego. So the ego aspires to unconsciousness, and the id is where all the consciousness comes from. One further thought, in case there are any of you who still don't believe me. As I realized this, to my horror, because I'm a psychoanalyst, as I realized, my God, we're going to have to completely invert our model, and what is this going to do to us? I realized in the process that, in fact, Freud's theory was itself inherently contradictory. Freud says here, as I read to you, that it's an established fact that feelings of pleasure and unpleasure govern the passage of events in the id with despotic force. The id obeys the inexorable pleasure principle. Now, who ever heard of a pleasure that is unconscious? So Freud's saying the feelings govern the passage of events in the id. The pleasure principle governs the passage of events in the id. And it's a bottom-up driving force. If the consciousness, if the feelings can only be felt up here, and consciousness up here, then consciousness would in fact be, the pleasure principle would be a top-down regulatory function on this pleasure principle, which clearly doesn't make any sense. The reality principle is the top-down inhibiting principle, and the pleasure principle, the feelings, come from below. They don't come from above. In other words, the consciousness, at least as far as feeling is concerned, comes from below. And as we've learned, as I summarized for you earlier, in what we know in affective and cognitive neuroscience today, is that those structures which generate the affects are the structures that generate all consciousness. I could have said more about that. I realized maybe there's something I should have said to you. The smallest area of brain that you need to lesion in order to produce a coma is the periaqueductal gray. The periaqueductal gray over there, where all the white arrows come from, is roughly the size of a jelly bean in the human brain. It is the most concentrated consciousness-producing structure that there is. And if you stimulate the PAG on its ventral surface and its dorsal surface, you produce affectively very different states of consciousness. Dorsal PAG, stimulate that, it produces excruciating pain, anxiety, rage, horrendous unpleasures. The animal and the human patient wants nothing more than that you should switch the stimulator off. Ventral PAG stimulation, by contrast, produces orgasmic delights. It's like, it's just wonderful. And so the so-called level of consciousness is produced by structures which are deeply, intrinsically, concentratedly affective. So this must have massive implications for the Freudian model, as I've said. Again, in case anybody's in any doubt, this is a child with hydranencephaly. That is to say, she's born with absolutely no cortex. There you see her brainstem is perfectly intact. And here, and of course, remember, there are sensory inputs into the brainstem. The external sensory receptor organs send projections not only to cortex but also into brainstem. But the brainstem ones are unconscious. That's where, for example, the famous blind sight comes from. That from the optic nerve to the superior colliculus, you have unconscious visual inputs, and so you see without being conscious of what you see. The cortex is what produces the conscious seeing, and the same applies to all the perceptual modalities. So this This child is able to receive sensory information from the outside world, she's just not able to form images of it. She's not able to have thoughts about it. She has no cognitive representations of the outside world, and importantly, no conscious ones. And here she is. Her baby brother is put, first of all, please note she's awake. She's conscious. She goes to sleep at night, she wakes up in the morning. In fact, this girl has absence seizures. Her parents can see when she's awake, when she's conscious, when she's lost consciousness. You know, it's very easy to see that she's conscious. But really interesting is the placing of her little brother onto her chest, and she goes, ah, like that, with the pleasure, a sort of nurturant, maternal attachment type of feeling is generated by the placing of her brother on her chest. And this, I'm just using one image. She has the full range of basic emotions, and they're always appropriately demonstrated. So she shows irritation and frustration, she shows rage, she shows fear, she shows playful behavior. She has a thing over her bed where she bangs the toys, and she has absolutely no perceptual consciousness, no possibility of perceptual consciousness, no cognition, no cortex, but she's a feeling, sentient being in the world. And that's just to illustrate the point that I'm making to you about how wrong is the idea that consciousness is a cortical function. That the mind, that the organ of the mind is the cortex. It's quite wrong. Here's another child with the same condition, just to show you there's not just one. This, just in case, here you can see I'm used to presenting to psychoanalysts and I have to defend myself. I know that they don't want to hear what I've just said, and so I have to, and then they say, I've made a category error, I'm neurologizing Freud. These abstractions of Freud's are not anatomical systems, you can't do what you've just done. So I like to read them this, where Freud says that consciousness comes from perception, and he says it will be seen that there's nothing daringly new in these assumptions. We've merely adopted the views on localization held by cerebral anatomy, which locates the seat of consciousness in the cerebral cortex, the outermost enveloping layer of the central organ. This is Freud, it's not Mark Solms. Amusingly, he goes on to say, cerebral anatomy has no need to consider why consciousness should be lodged on the surface of the brain instead of being safely housed somewhere in its innermost interior. Well, guess what? That's exactly where it is, safely housed in the brain's innermost interior. Now, the principle that I spoke to you about earlier when I spoke about how these brainstem regulatory structures work, I just made a little drawing here to illustrate how it works, that what Freud called nirvana, that is to say nothingness, there's no need. That is the homeostatic set point. Remember what I said to you earlier. Deviations from that set point are felt as unpleasures, and pleasures mean you're heading back in the right direction. This is how pleasure and unpleasure regulates. Consciousness regulates the intentional behavior of the organism in the service of these basic biological values that I spoke to you about earlier. Had I more time and had you more interest in such things, I would show you how this shows that Freud's nirvana principle is not something separate from his pleasure principle. Pleasure and unpleasure are ways in which we regulate our attempt to get to our goal, which is nirvana, which is certainly not a deathly state. It is the most perfectly life-sustaining position that the organism can be in. So why I'm showing you this slide is to make this counterintuitive point, which is that the aim of learning from experience, the aim of volitional behavior, the aim of intentional action is to get to no consciousness. Consciousness is a problem. Feelings are demands on the mind to perform work, and you're aiming for no consciousness. That's what learning from experience is for. That's the goal of the ego. So the id is conscious. My little word, the circle around id says needs. So our needs are felt, and the ego aspires to be unconscious. The ego is learning how to resolve your needs. So the relationship between the ego and the id is not one of consciousness in the ego being dragged down into the id. It's rather quite the other way around. The id is felt, it's making demands on the mind to perform work, and the ego manages these feelings first and foremost through conscious cognition. This is what consciousness is for. I alluded to this earlier, I'm now spelling it out a little bit more fully. Consciousness is salience. Consciousness means I need to feel my way through this thing. I need to make a choice or a decision here. It's what free will is all about. Feeling is the value system whereby we make choices. If consciousness were not attached to cognition, then when you're learning something new, you wouldn't know which is the right and which is the wrong answer. So what's good and bad in biology is registered in terms of feeling. That's why we have consciousness attached to cognition while we need it. But we don't always need it, because once you've cracked the problem, you then consolidate the solution. That's what learning from experience is all about. That's how our cortical memory systems work. So up here we have so-called working memory. That's what I've just described as conscious cognition. That's working on a problem where you have to feel your way through the thing. But once you've once you've solved the problem, you no longer need to be conscious of it, and then you put it into long-term memory, and there are declarative and non-declarative long-term memory systems. And first and foremost, we go into the declarative systems, which are cortical. And this is where we still have images. And the importance of images is that you can think them again. You can in cognitive perceptual consciousness, you can relive the experience, feel your way through the thing again in working memory, and then you reconsolidate. And that's the word that we use in cognitive neuroscience. It's called consolidation and reconsolidation. It's an iterative process between working memory and long-term memory. The long-term memory does its job unconsciously. I can't emphasize that enough. But when it doesn't work, we call it prediction error, then it becomes salient, and then that cognitive action plan, that what I must do in this situation, becomes salient, it re-enters working memory, and then you feel your way through the thing again, and then you reconsolidate. It's a very fascinating process, the physiology of reconsolidation. I won't get sidetracked, but I really would like to get sidetracked, but I won't, about reconsolidation. But I hope you can see this relates deeply to what psychoanalysis is all about, making things conscious so that you can change them, and then they become unconscious again. That is how declarative memory works. I'm not going into all the details, episodic versus semantic. Episodic memory is very concrete, very inefficient way of learning. I did it like this on Monday, I did it like this on Tuesday, I did it like this on Wednesday, I remember. You generalize the rule, then it goes into semantic memory. And that's consolidation. As the solution becomes better and better, and it fits the bill more and more reliably, so it becomes more and more deeply consolidated, until ultimately it enters into non-declarative memory systems. Why am I telling you all of this? I'll tell you, let me just take a step aside and make a meta comment. Why am I telling you all of this? First of all, I'm explaining what conscious cognition is for, where consciousness fits in relation to cognition. But I'm also showing you what unconscious cognition is for. This is what Freud would have called pre-conscious. Declarative long-term memories are pre-conscious. It means they can be brought back to mind and reconsolidated. And that can happen because they are cortical, because they are images, they can be experienced perceptually in the way that Freud spoke of. The non-declarative memories, what Freud called unconscious memories, these are not declarative, which means they cannot be declared. It means they cannot be thought. They cannot be rendered explicit. And that's because they are no longer cortical. They are now subcortical. And I would like to emphasize particularly the striatal, the basal ganglionic procedural memory system, and the emotional memory system, which centers above all else on the amygdala. These subcortical memory structures do not form images. They are in the nature of associations. Stimulus response, and it's what Freud called primary process. Boom, boom. The one thing just leads to the other. No thought required. No thought in between. And I say no thought required because these are much more efficient memory systems in terms of what must the animal do, us included, what must I do in order to survive and reproduce in this situation, what works. I've automatized something, I don't think about it, I do it immediately. These are like the innate predictions, except they're acquired. In fact, the innate predictions are also in these striatal subcortical memory systems. So these are where the instinctual predictions are, and then we overlay them with learning from experience. And what I need to emphasize here is that the whole tenor of this is again toward unconsciousness. The ideal of learning is rendering automatic. It means I've cracked it, I've solved it, I know how to meet this need, that's what I do. And it's not only in terms of biological efficiencies, which are obvious, it's also in terms of the actual mechanism of these different memory systems. Working memory is a tiny place. You're only able to hold 7 bits of information in working memory at any one point in time, which is why telephone numbers are 7 digits long. If you try and hold 8, 9, 10 digits in mind, you can't, because it's exceeded the size of working memory. It's a little bottleneck, and it's therefore also an extremely precious resource. You can't be thinking consciously about everything. You're only thinking consciously about what you need to, which is what paying attention is for. That's what salience means. And so there's great pressure to render things unconscious as rapidly as you can, which is why the vast bulk of what we do, as I said, Barjan Chartrand said, 95% of our goal-directed actions are executed unconsciously. That's the design of this organism, of all of us, in fact. Now, as I said, why am I telling you this? It's also because when I say to you that the id is conscious, I'm not saying there is no such a thing as the unconscious. It's just not the same place as the id. There is an unconscious in the brain. The unconscious, what is the unconscious and where is it located in the brain? It's in the basal ganglia. Remember, the amygdala is tied to the tail of the caudate nucleus. These are these deep subcortical, non-representational, associative memory structures, and that's the unconscious. So I'm not saying there isn't an unconscious, but please note here we have a new problem. So this problem is that this unconscious that I've just described, and again I've described to you standard mainstream cognitive science, this is not controversial what I'm telling you, it's a very wholesome thing. The unconscious is great, it's where all your solutions are. And as you know, that's not the unconscious of Freud. Freud's unconscious is where all your problems are. And so, here again we have a major contradiction between psychoanalysis and cognitive science, and we need to resolve that. So I would like to tell you how I propose to resolve that. And here again we have a little bit of theory. But the value of neuroscientific theory is it's testable. It gives rise to testable predictions. We've got the methods to test these things, and that's what neuropsychoanalysis is for. So the unconscious of the cognitive scientists seems to function in a radically different way from the unconscious of the psychoanalysts. And I think we need only one assumption in order to solve that apparently profound contradiction, and that is this. There are insoluble problems in life. This all works fine if you can solve all your problems, but if there are problems that you can't solve, then what do? Well, I submit to you, you have 2 choices. Either you obsess, you OCD about them forever, your consciousness is full all the time of these insoluble problems that you round and round and round and round. It's all I can think about. Now, I'm 4 years old. There's these big people, the adults, they're in charge. I want to be in charge. Now, so I want it. So the children have all the same emotional needs as you and me, but they really are very ill-equipped to meet those needs. I want to be big. I don't want to be the kid. I want to be I want to be the parent. I want to make babies. Now, but how do I make babies? I don't know. Let me think. Like, I want to make babies with her. Ooh, but she's with him. This is, by the way, called the Oedipus complex. I'm trying to illustrate that children have needs, emotional needs, that they want to master in the same way as we all want to master our needs, but they're ill-equipped to master them. And they have these 2 choices. Either they obsess about these needs forever, and they use up their little bit of working memory on insoluble problems, and then they don't have space to learn how to do their alphabet and their times tables and how to tie shoelaces and so on. Or they cut their losses, and they say, fuck it, I'm not thinking about that anymore. Okay? That's called repression. Repression is exactly the same as all other automatizations, except it is done prematurely or illegitimately. So I automatize my best guess. I automatize my childish notion, because it's the only thing I can come up with. I can't come up with anything better. There's no point in thinking about it anymore. So I'm going to consolidate and not reconsolidate. When there's prediction error, I'm not going to think about it again, because it's pointless. So you prematurely, illegitimately automatize predictions as to what to do when you're in a state of need, even though it doesn't work. The only difference between that so-called dynamic unconscious, this Freudian unconscious, and the rest of the cognitive unconscious is that these predictions lead you to bang your head against the wall. Over and over again, you do something that doesn't work, and I hope you notice I'm now beginning to talk about psychopathology. So the repressed Again, I'm using archaic terms, but I'm translating them into visualizable, testable, experimentally tractable neural systems. I'm saying to you that the unconscious is these basal ganglionic, non-declarative memory systems where things are automatized. Some of them, most of them, thank God, are automatized for very good reasons, because this is the best thing best way to go about meeting your needs in the world, surviving and reproducing. But it also includes these prematurely and illegitimately automatized ones which do not regulate the affects. The need does not get met by those predictions. They don't work. And so the affect stays. And so our patients suffer mainly from feelings. And this, had I more time, I see I'm at the end of my hour, but this leads directly into the question of what is psychotherapy for? How does the whole thing work? It clearly doesn't work the way, as I said, it doesn't work the way that the talking cure is supposed to work. We're doing something different than what we thought we were doing. And this is beginning to make sense of what we're actually doing. So, in my view, let me start by saying again, our patients suffer mainly from feelings. That means our patients suffer mainly from emotional needs that they do not know how to meet in the world. Had I more time, I would tell you what those emotional needs are. We have a very good understanding of the basic emotional needs of the mammalian brain, and interestingly, the human brain is no different in terms of its base. In fact, I will just quickly mention them. There's lust, the sexual instinct. There's seeking, which is a foraging instinct. There's fear, which I've already illustrated to you. There's panic, grief, which is this attachment thing that I spoke to you about earlier. I spoke only about the panic part of it, which is the protest phase. There's also the despair phase, if reunion is not established quickly enough, then the animal goes into a slump. Same with us. That looks for all the world like depression. It is the normal phenotype for depression. And the question is, why does this horrible thing happen? It's because, bad as it feels, this enhances the separated, the juvenile's chances of surviving. Because if mother hasn't heard your calls within a relatively short period of time, she's probably not going to respond. It's probably best to stop announcing to predators that you're a little mammal that has no one looking after it. And also it's probably best not to wander too far from home base, because when, please God, mum does come back, you won't be there. And also you're using up metabolic resources that you need more than ever because there's nobody there to feed you. So the slump, the giving up, the hopelessness, I have no interest, no expectation that I'm going to find anything good in the world, that despair phase, that's, we think in neuropsychoanalysis, we think that's what it's there for. There's also nurturant maternal care. That's another one of our basic emotional needs. And lastly, surprisingly, there's play. Mammals need to play. And that's a whole other lecture if I could explain to you why do mammals need to play. But these are our 7 major emotional needs. Lust, foraging, fear, rage, did I mention? I forgot rage. Panic, separation, distress, and despair, which is part of the same thing. Nurture and care, and play. By the way, had I more time, I would also want to say to you, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, that these basic emotional need systems, the chemistry of which we understand very well, this, I think, is what you guys should be basing your taxonomy on. This should replace this DSM artifice. You know, these are the natural kinds, and there's some big surprises there. I really think this is an important potential future direction for psychiatric nosologizing. Let me just use the panic grief system as an example. First of all, we know that the panic phase, that the feeling safe and fuzzy and warm and attached, is mu-opioid mediated. So panic is low mu-opioid receptor binding. That's what makes the panicky feeling. And by the way, it's addictive. Love, attachment is an addiction. This is why those substances are so addictive, opiates. That's so mu-opioid. The low mu-opioid levels leads to rising kappa-opioid binding, dynorphin, which shuts down dopamine, shuts down seeking. So that separation distress cascade, we know the neurochemistry of it. That in turn points to potential new directions for drug development. If only there were safe opiates, we would have a fantastic drug there. But it's not only a matter of drug development, it's also a matter of understanding how these things relate to each other. Panic disorder is in anxiety disorders in the DSM. Mood disorders are a whole different world. But why is there such high comorbidity between depression and panic? It's because they're two aspects of the same natural kind. There's